We are very excited to have yet another Fubon Center Fireside Chat. We've got over 200 registrants here, and I'm super excited. I'm going to introduce myself real quick, and then I'm going to introduce our guest, and then we'll launch right into our topic for today. So I'm Melissa Schilling. I'm a professor at New York University in innovation and strategy. Most of my research is on innovation strategy and high technology industries. And I've been at NYU for at least, I think, about 21 years. And our guest today has been at NYU even longer than that. So we have Nicholas Economides, an internationally recognized academic authority on network economics, electronic commerce, and public policy. He's been a professor at NYU for more years than me, so we'll say more than 25 years at least. And he's published more than 100 articles in top academic journals in the areas of networks, telecommunications, oligopoly, antitrust, product positioning, and liquidity, and the organization of financial markets and exchanges. So also lately been talking quite a bit about digital privacy. So really a perfect person to talk to us today about our topic, which is about who owns your intellectual property that you put on the internet, and how should privacy laws and opt-in and opt-out laws be constructed to address privacy. So welcome, Nicholas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, I'm just going to open it up with a pretty general question then. For those of our audience who are not familiar with the ways in which their data is being used, can you tell us something about the way people's data is being harvested and used when they use applications like Facebook or Google?
The internet companies, platforms such as Google, Facebook, collect a lot of data from the users. And that includes not only search words, but also location, whatever they can, really, from the users. And of course, for Facebook, there is a lot of interaction, and there is a lot of stuff that people put up in Facebooks, like pictures, likes, and stories, and so on and so on. So there is a tremendous amount of data that is being collected from the users. And unfortunately, the users don't quite understand that this is going on. By getting into the service, Google or Facebook, they are automatically accepting the terms of service of Google and Facebook, and therefore are automatically giving all this data to Google and Facebook. So, Melissa, I think we should go on with your next question.
Okay. So I think a lot of people probably realize that when they go on Google and search for something, or Amazon or Facebook, that those sites are using their data to target advertising. Are there other ways in which the sites are using their data that people might not be thinking about?
Well, there might be ways which are not explicitly written in the contract. For example, there have been issues, if you remember, during the previous presidential elections, that there was data collected from Facebook which was used in ways that people didn't expect it to be used, and possibly a violation of the terms of use of Facebook. So there is this problem that since nobody really reads the fine print, a lot of data might be used in ways that are not exactly how it is being described in the terms of use. But more importantly also, people are not necessarily compensated for the data. You cannot use Google search unless you accept to give your data to Google. And there might be people who would like to pay for search, for internet search in Google, but at the same time would not want to give their data to Google, or would like to be compensated monetarily for that data. And that's what we have. We have a missing market. The market for the sale of personal information is missing, is not there. So that's kind of our fundamental problem, that we do not have a functioning market. We have a market failure. And the internet companies, Google, Facebook, have imposed this on consumers, on users.
Okay, yeah. You know, I recently discovered that even so under HIPAA laws in the United States, if you go see a doctor, information about that doctor's visit is protected, but information about your prescriptions isn't protected. That data is actually aggregated by the prescription providers like CVS and companies like that, and they sell that to these big database warehouse, for lack of a better word, database warehouses is probably a better word for that. So really, and you can figure out a lot about somebody's medical situation by the prescriptions they're taking. So I was really stunned to find out that they can actually sell your prescription data, and most people have no idea.
Well, that's true. And additionally, Google buys data from hospitals about your visit to the hospital, about your treatments, and so on. So essentially, Google is trying to create a profile of you as good as it can to be able to sell you all your characteristics, all your features to the advertisers, and hopefully the advertisers will pay much, much more if they know more about you. And that has gone way further than you think. Google has bought a company that collects it switches on your lights from room to room using Wi-Fi. And that means that Google can find out what room of the house you are at different times of the day. When do you go to sleep? When do you go to the bathroom? When do you watch TV? And so on. So, and presumably, these are useful to advertisers. But in any case, Google puts it together, creates the profile, and sells it to advertisers.
So when Google is selling this data to these other third parties, is it being sold with your identity? I guess it would have to be for them to make use of that data, right?
Well, I mean, Google wants to use it itself and also sell it. So there are two different functions here. I mean, some of the data is used directly by Google, and some is packaged and sold to information brokers who then use it further on themselves. So, and these are the two typical ways in which data is being used.
And what do you see as being the way to rectify this problem?
Well, first of all, people should go away from opting in automatically. Right now, as soon as you get the Google service or as soon as you sign up for Facebook, you are automatically giving your data because these are the terms of service. Now, one way to go forward is to make sure that this is not automatic. So I call the present regime opt-in default. So we need to go to opt-out default. What does this mean? It means that when you get your Google service or your Facebook service, even though Google or Facebook might collect your data, they will have no legal right to use it unless you give them an explicit okay to use the data. So you're automatically in the opt-out world, and then you have to take some action to get into opt-in or get a payment or something like that. So this obviously is not in the interest of the networks. Google and Facebook don't want you to go to default opt-out. So default opt-out has to be set up by a regulator, a sectoral regulator or an antitrust authority. It has to be imposed on the companies because the companies don't have the financial interest to do that. So first of all, we need to get to opt-out. Once we get to opt-out, there might be subsequent things to do as well.
Yeah, so it strikes me, I mean, that's sort of a base level minimum requirement we could have, but it's very binary, right? You're either in or you're out. I'm wondering why we haven't used more licensing. Why don't we use other licensing models that we have for other kinds of intellectual property in this domain? So for example, it seems like, first of all, one of the big obstacles to users playing a volitional role in controlling their data is the way those terms of agreement are written. I mean, I don't know anyone who sits there and actually reads the terms of agreement. They're too complicated, they're too long, they're in really small font, and it would take too long. And most people just assume that, you know, the free market or government regulators are looking out for them. So that, I mean, I tend to assume this. I tend to assume, well, everybody else is using Google, so it must be safe. Now, what if we had instead some sort of really simple, user-friendly licensing model where you had some toggles that would give the user more control over how their data is used? So, for example, I was thinking one toggle might be how long your data can be used. Right? There would be a difference between data that you can that the firm could use immediately, like this week or this month, versus they could keep the data for 3 years versus letting them keep the data indefinitely, which I think is by default what they have right now, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Right? It's crazy to think that they have access to your data indefinitely. I'm not even going to be the same person in 10 years, and certainly my kids aren't going to be. So that's pretty nuts. And then I thought you could have a toggle for something like breadth of use. You could have a toggle that says, you can only use this data for the website I'm on when I'm putting in this data, versus being able to transfer it to someone else or sell it to someone else or integrate it with the other kinds of data that you collect on me or other parties collect on me. And then the last piece I thought there should definitely be a toggle for, because it would be so easy to add this toggle and people will have an opinion about it. This opinion is going to vary depending on the kind of data they're putting in. But I would like to be able to have a choice over whether that data is identified. Like, is it going to have my name on it? Or is it just going to have my demographic information on it? Or is it going to be completely anonymous and there's going to be some criteria that makes it so that there's no way you could connect it to me through looking at the demographic data? What are your thoughts on something like that? Is that just too complicated, or is that feasible?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to get into the regime of opt-out. Once we have a regime of opt-out, then we can create a way to partially give some rights to Google or Facebook of use of our data. And there can be a gradation of rights. There could be that we allow them to use the data, for example, for general advertising, but we don't allow them to use them for political campaigns. There could be all kinds of gradations there. But these gradations should come after the default has been set to opt out, and then you opt in, you get a certain payment, and depending on what you're offering and who you are, you might get different payments. So we need to get to that regime, and the market has to start functioning. The market for selling your personal information has to start functioning, because right now the networks have imposed a market failure. That market has been killed, and that's kind of the huge issue that we have.
Yeah, that makes a tremendous amount of sense. Now, one thing I've often wondered is how, when I go online and I put in, I'd have to think of an example of what I might be putting in. Let's say I'm posting something on Facebook. How is that not, I mean, the what I write must be covered by copyright already, right? And if I were to post a picture, that's going to be covered by intellectual property rights too. So why isn't what we put in already covered somehow? How is that information different when we put in data about ourselves? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think that the terms of service that I believe that the terms of service that Facebook has are such that you relinquish your copyright rights when you post a picture on Facebook. I'm not necessarily, I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think that's the case. So there are the kind of details of the contract that may impose on you a transfer of ownership for content that is being uploaded to Facebook.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're waiving your rights when you get on the platform, and you don't even know exactly what you're waiving rights to exactly. That's pretty amazing. Do you know of anyone? Is anyone? Sorry, go on.
And I was going to say also, you have to keep in mind that this world is not static, that the terms of service have been changed a number of times over the years. So the terms of service in 2012 were different than the terms of service in 2020. And there is a lot of confusion also among the users on what is really the present regime.
Have you looked at GDPR very much? What do you think about that? Has that been a big? Does it help a lot? To what degree is that going to help resolve some of this?
GDPR is a kind of rights-based approach, which means that you have the right to privacy and you have the right to see some things that the companies are collecting about you and so on. I would like to see a solution which is more market-based, a solution where, in fact, you get compensated if you want to sell your data, and you don't give away your data for free. This is not quite the GDPR approach. The GDPR approach is that you have certain rights and we're going to enforce them, but it doesn't talk about markets and it doesn't talk about payments. But I think that here, there is a huge market that is being suppressed, that is being killed, and we need to make it operate as a market. And like any other market in the United States, it's regulated by antitrust law. So we need to get to that point in which the market exists, the market operates, and it's also regulated by antitrust law. And in that regulation, we should keep in mind that both Google and Facebook have tremendous market power. They're dominant companies in their areas of their work. So it has to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, when I was looking at when I was doing a little bit of looking at GDPR today and realizing that it's mostly just around consent, and most people are going to consent in order to use the service. So it doesn't accomplish as much as we're talking about that should be accomplished here.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a solution of the type that we need to pursue, especially in the United States. And in the United States, we don't even have GDPR anyway, which is just it's a European law. But I think in the United States, we need to reach a point in which the dominance of Google and Facebook is taken into consideration by antitrust authorities, and we find solutions that help the consumers and are better for the general public, because the present world is great for Google and Facebook, but it's not great for the consumers. The consumers don't get compensated.
So it seems like in such a concentrated market where you have some really powerful players, it might only take an active move by one or two of those big players towards a more progressive model to tip the whole world in that direction. Do you see any signs that Google or Facebook or even Amazon are thinking about doing something like this?
Well, I wouldn't put Amazon in the same category, but let's say about Google and Facebook, I do not see them going into that direction. In fact, it seems like they're going in the opposite direction. They are consolidating their power, they're consolidating their dominance, and collecting more information from human beings like you and me helps them have more market power, have more network effects, more value inside the company, and potentially less value to any potential competitor who doesn't have all these people connecting to it and all these network effects. So somehow the present model not only hurts users, because they don't get compensated, but additionally helps the companies become monopolists, to become more dominant in what they're doing, and hurts competition. We would like to see a world in which there are strong competitors to Google. There are strong competitors to Facebook. This is what would be great, but the present situation doesn't go in that direction at all. The present behavior of the companies doesn't go in that direction at all.
What do you think is easier? Do you think it's going to be easier to change the competitive structure of those industries, or is it going to be easier to just get some regulation in place that these companies have to adhere to? Because it seems to me like the latter sounds simpler, but maybe I'm being naive about this.
Well, I mean, some intervention by the antitrust authorities would be absolutely necessary, because we need to get to the opt-out regime, first of all, to start with. And then we need to see what else we need to do further on. It's possible that there might be, the politicians have proposed a whole bunch of different solutions, like breakups and things like that. It's also possible that there might be other more technology-based solutions, such as interoperability, like we have in the telephone systems. If I can digress a bit, before 1934, the telephone networks were independent from each other, disconnected. So AT&T had one network, other companies had different networks, each company had its own network, and they weren't talking to each other. By 1934, it became mandatory for the networks to talk to each other. And that's why now we're not worrying about I'm being on AT&T, you're being on Verizon. We don't worry that we won't be able to talk. But before 1934, we couldn't. So there might be a way through interoperability to allow data and connections, for example, in Facebook, to be transported, if the user wanted, to another Facebook, another competitor of Facebook. So that way, the hurdle of competitors to Facebook might be very significantly reduced, because I, as a user of Facebook, could sign up to the other network, and together with signing up, I can bring over my connections. I can tell the other network, look, I mean, I also have these 500 people who are my friends or my followers, and so on. So this could be accomplished through interoperability. And that's what happened in 1934 in the telephone system, and has remained that way since then. And there might be, as I said, technical solutions, more technology-based solutions that can solve the problem better, even better than what the politicians propose, like breaking up the companies in pieces.
So this is kind of an interesting way to think about it, and I hadn't thought about this before, but in the telecommunication networks, you had different firms with different infrastructure assets, and then they were required to basically make all those assets connected so that users could use any of those assets, and it eroded the monopoly that any given phone company would have in a given area. In this case, the assets are basically data. Our ability for Google, the ability to yield a really great search result is the assets, and so we would want users on alternative platforms to have access to those same assets. So if I were Will Baumol, for example, right here, I would probably say something like, we need a mandatory licensing program where basically Google's required to license that data to all comers. Is that something that would work?
We will see. I mean, I wouldn't be able to say right now for sure we want this or not, but I would say that we need to create a level playing field, both in search and in social network type services. And what has happened is because we let these companies do whatever they wanted for a very long time, they have consolidated their monopoly positions, and it's hard to understand how we would be if we had competition for the last 10 years or the last 15 years. So it's not an easy problem at all to fix something that has gone so wrong. And I'm not saying this to try not to answer the question, but it's an open question, and it needs a lot of work to try to create a competitive situation in a social network or in search when the existing dominant companies have consolidated so strongly their position for a long period of time.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying we probably have to solve the concentration problem before we will be able to solve the data rights problem. It's funny, as we were talking, I noticed this green flashing light appear behind me. And I suddenly remembered that the woman of Amazon, who shall go nameless because she will start talking if we say her name, is also listening in on this conversation as we speak. So a lot of little ears everywhere. We have some questions in the Q&A box. Let me see what we got here. All right. I'm going to start with a question here by Rob Siemens. Is this issue about not being compensated for my data something specific to big tech or an issue more generally? What other industries are there in which data is used without my consent? Banks, mail order companies?
Yes, I think in general, this is a more general issue. He's right, Rob is right. It's a more general issue. It's much more acute in tech than in other areas. Also, in some of these other areas, because of traditional regulation, the companies cannot use the data they have collected. For example, AT&T collects information on your calls, right? Because they know who you called, but they are not allowed by regulation to use it. And even when you call AT&T and ask for a change of service, for example, they ask you, do we have the right to see your bill? And use the information because they're regulated. And there are similar issues in some banking services, but not all. So this kind of regulations have evolved in other areas, in other industries. And now I think we are at the point in which they need to be evolve also in this area.
Yeah, I mean, actually, as you were just saying that, you made me wonder why all these devices that actually monitor the things we say are right. Well, certainly the things we say, why aren't they in violation of existing wiretapping rules, right? It's illegal for me to record conversations in most states in the United States. It's illegal for me to record conversations without someone's consent.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't be able to answer that one.
Well, hopefully we have a lawyer in the audience because I'd love to hear the answer to that. In the meantime, we have another question here from Ora Nicknamfard. It's saying, is self-sovereignty of our digital identities a possible goal? Will there be companies competing to try to be our digital wallet? And who do you think those players may be? Maybe Clear, or I think they mean the Clear that you see at the airport, or credit card providers, Apple or Google?
Well, that's a good question. Once the market starts for our personal information, once the market starts, we don't quite know how it's going to be evolved, what its industry structure is going to be. We don't know 100% that. But generally speaking, I would expect that some of the information brokers who right now collect information not directly from us, but they buy information and then they sell it to other parties, that some of these guys might get involved in the retail collection of information, in the retail business where Google and Facebook are. But it's all speculative what I'm saying right now. We don't know for sure how this is going to go forward.
Yeah, actually, it's very related to another. Sorry.
Okay. I was going to say it's also very possible that the dominant positions that Google and Facebook have managed to create will push aside all competition there, except if there is very strong antitrust or regulatory intervention.
Yeah, so Rob Siemens brings up another really interesting point around this. He asks if we did adopt some sort of opt-out policy, what would happen to the data that the big incumbents already have? Like if they were allowed to keep it, maybe they would have a huge advantage that nobody else could replicate now. Or if they weren't allowed to keep it, like, well, what do you think? What would happen if we had an opt-out policy? Would these incumbents have to give up the data they've already aggregated?
That's a good question. I think we're not there yet. Let's get to the point in which the opt-out is established for new interactions, and then we'll find a way to see what we're going to do with the old accumulated data. I don't think that's going to be. I think it's a very interesting question. I don't think it's the crucial question right now, because the crucial question for us is right now to get to the point in which you clearly own your data and you are at the default of opt-out.
Yeah, great. Q Kim asks, if one posts a photo to Instagram, would that be waiving his or her rights to the photo to Instagram Meta /Meta? Can he change the setting and still use the platform? So I guess what they're asking is to what degree, when you post pictures online, are you waiving your rights to the pictures? I don't know the answer to that question.
I wouldn't be able to answer this definitively. We should ask lawyers who have read all the fine print of the agreements.
Yeah, I was saying when you were struggling with the computer problems, I was telling about this thing that my son read about and showed me on Instagram this past week. A woman was a photographer, a prolific photographer, and as a service to the general community, she had donated all of these beautiful pictures to the Library of Congress so that they would be available to anyone. And then subsequently on a later day, she posted one of her own pictures, and then she got an immediate cease and desist from Getty Images, who said, you can't use that picture without paying us for it. And she took Getty to court and said, wait a minute, these are my pictures. Turns out Getty was selling her images all over the place. So Getty was using these pictures and selling them, for all the uses that Getty sells pictures for. And so the woman took Getty to court to say, hey, that's not fair. These are actually my pictures that I donated to the Library of Congress. And the court found in favor of Getty and said, look, you relinquished these photos to the Library of Congress, which permitted Getty to then use them and sell them to others. So that was a kind of remarkable outcome, I think, of intellectual property rights. It would have never occurred to me.
Well, that's a fascinating story. Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but it's fascinating, and I'm surprised, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I was surprised too. I mean, I think that I think this is a situation where the law just hasn't kept up with the technology, right? That we've got the digital platforms have taken over in all these domains so rapidly and become so powerful and multifunctional and exciting so fast that it's been impossible for law to keep up with it, right? The law moves pretty slowly. Regulation moves pretty slowly. And so it's, I think it's just I don't think it's some of these situations are probably easy to resolve if we can sit down and do it, but it's just, we haven't kept up with it.
Well, we definitely haven't kept up with it. And I think there was a lot of inertia, both among the regulators and the politicians. And sometimes it was also a question of not quite understanding how these markets worked. What exactly is going on with Google? What exactly is going on with Facebook? And even sometimes in congressional hearings, you can see that the senators or the congressmen don't quite ask the right questions because they don't know this industry that well, even though they have very good staff and so on. So it's a cutting edge technology, and regulators have also have to understand it very well as well to be able to regulate it appropriately. And unfortunately, for a decade or more, we left it aside without intervention at all. And now we're paying the price. And now we have to solve a much harder problem to fix the present environment.
So I always make my students finish all of their analyses with with at least one very specific and actionable recommendation, sometimes multiple specific and actionable recommendations, like something that would tell us who needs to do exactly what in the future and why, and whether there's any costs and risks of it. So now I'm going to pose that question to you. If you were going to make a very specific and actionable recommendation on this issue, who would you make it to, and what would that recommendation be?
Well, the first recommendation, and this is kind of the fundamental one because it needs to be done first, is that we get to a default opt-out in which even if the information is collected by the platform, it is illegal to use it unless there is an explicit additional consent by the user. We need to get to that first. We need to establish a market. The second thing is we need to establish a market for buying and selling of this personal information. It cannot anymore be acquired by fiat. Just because you are a customer of Google, Google gets your information. That's not okay. This is not how markets work. So the market needs to exist, and it needs to be function. And like any market, some people are going to buy and some people are not going to buy. Some people are going to sell their information and some people are not going to sell their information. So we need to get to that world instead of the present world in which the market doesn't work and the price has been set arbitrarily to zero. So I would say these are the first two things, and there may be many others that will follow, but this is kind of the required start.
Okay, but now if you were in my class, I would press you on this. I would say how. So how? Who has the authority to get us to the default of being opt-out? And how do we get this market? Who can do that? What does this require?
Well, first of all, a general antitrust enforcement like the Federal Trade Commission has sufficient power to impose the opt-out and the market. It needs, of course, to win a lawsuit against Google or Facebook. It needs to win first, but once it has won, then it has the authority and wide-ranging authority to impose remedies, and one of the remedies has to be this requirement of opt-out, the creation of the market for personal information. And as I said, there are many other subsequent issues, like the issue of interoperability. Should we try to create interoperability like we have on the phones, on the telephones, or not? But these are kind of the second wave of issues. The first one is the opt-out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Nicholas. I'm Professor Economides. It has been awesome to hear your perspective on this. And I don't think we have any more questions in the Q&A. So I want to thank everybody so much for coming, and to remind you, these are an ongoing series of Fireside Chats. We have Fireside Chats on all sorts of cool innovation topics, fintech topics, artificial intelligence topics. So drop by the Fubon website and you can find out what our upcoming events are there. And thank you so much for coming. And I'm just going to extend my own round of applause to Nicholas Economides, and hopefully you all are applauding in your own homes. And thank you so much again. By the way, we're also going to have this available as a recording within about a week or two. We'll post this as a recording that you can share with others. So thank you again for joining us, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and let me also thank you and the audience.